Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been underestimated. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with delicate features that made her look younger than her 28 years, she was accustomed to people making assumptions about her capabilities. What they couldn't see beneath her unassuming exterior was the result of 8 years of the most grueling military training the United States had to offer. The humid air of the Jacksonville bar clung to her skin as she sat alone at a corner table, nursing a club soda. She had arrived in town just hours earlier for a classified briefing scheduled for the following morning. The dive bar wasn't her usual scene, but, after months of intense deployment in Afghanistan, she craved normalcy, the sound of laughter, casual conversation, and the simple pleasure of sitting somewhere without constantly scanning for threats. Sarah had chosen civilian clothes deliberately, a simple sundress and sandals that helped her blend in with the local crowd. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, freed from the tight regulations of military protocol. For the first time in months, she looked like any other young woman enjoying an evening out. It was exactly the anonymity she sought. The bar buzzed with typical Friday night energy. College students clustered around pool tables, their voices rising above the classic rock playing from speakers mounted in the corners. A few couples occupied dimly lit booths along the walls, and, scattered throughout were groups of what appeared to be military personnel, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes but still carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of service members. Sarah had been observing the room with the unconscious habit of someone trained to assess her environment. Her eyes had catalogued exits, potential weapons, and the general mood of the crowd. Everything seemed routine until a group of 5 Marines entered, their voices already elevated from what appeared to be several hours of drinking at other establishments. They were the type she had encountered countless times throughout her career, young, physically imposing, and radiating the particular brand of confidence that came with being part of an elite fighting force. Their uniforms were crisp, their bearing proud, but their movements carried the loose coordination of men who had consumed significant amounts of alcohol. Corporal Mike Rodriguez led the group, his broad shoulders and commanding presence making him a natural leader among his peers. At 25, he had completed 2 tours in Iraq and carried himself with the swagger of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. Behind him followed Sergeant Jake Thompson, a tall, lean Texan whose easy smile masked a competitive nature that had driven him to excel in every physical challenge the Corps had thrown at him. The other 3, Lance Corporals David Kim, Marcus Washington, and Tony Castellano, were younger but no less imposing. They had bonded during basic training and had been inseparable ever since, their friendship forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect for each other's abilities. Sarah watched them settle at a table near the bar, their conversation growing louder as they ordered another round. She recognized the pattern, young warriors letting off steam, probably between deployments or fresh back from overseas. She had seen it countless times and generally felt a sense of kinship with fellow service members, even if they didn't know she was one of them. What she couldn't have anticipated was how the evening would shift when one of them noticed her. It started innocuously enough. Marcus had been scanning the room when his eyes landed on Sarah's table. Something about her stillness in the chaotic environment caught his attention. While everyone else seemed animated and social, she sat quietly, almost meditatively, with an alertness that seemed unusual for a civilian. "Check out the girl in the corner," Marcus said, nodding in Sarah's direction. "She's been sitting there for an hour, barely touched her drink." The others turned to look, their alcohol-impaired judgment immediately jumping to conclusions. "Probably waiting for someone who's not gonna show," Jake suggested, his Texas drawl becoming more pronounced with each beer. "Or she's one of those military groupies looking to hook up with some Marines," Tony added, his Brooklyn accent cutting through the ambient noise. Sarah felt their attention but didn't react outwardly. She had learned long ago that acknowledging such scrutiny often led to unwanted interactions. Instead, she maintained her relaxed posture while mentally cataloging their positions and the quickest route to the exit. The Marines' conversation continued, growing more animated and less filtered as their blood alcohol levels rose. What had started as casual observation began morphing into something more concerning as their group dynamic took over. "She keeps looking over here," David observed, though Sarah had done nothing more than occasionally glance in their direction, a habit born from tactical awareness rather than romantic interest. "Maybe we should go introduce ourselves," Rodriguez suggested, his leadership instincts corrupted by alcohol and peer pressure. Sarah recognized the shift in their energy before they did. She had seen it countless times in various contexts, the moment when a group of young men, emboldened by alcohol and each other's presence, decided to act on impulses they might normally suppress. Her training had taught her to identify such situations before they escalated, but she also knew that leaving now might actually draw more attention to herself. She decided to finish her drink and make a quiet exit, hoping to avoid any confrontation. Unfortunately, the Marines had already committed to their course of action. The 5 men approached her table with the confident swagger of those who had never been told no by someone they perceived as physically inferior. Their formation was unconsciously tactical, Rodriguez in the lead with the others spreading out to prevent easy escape routes. It was the kind of positioning they had been trained to use in hostile situations, now repurposed for what they saw as a social interaction. "Evening, Miss," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to having respected. "Couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone. Mind if we join you?" Sarah looked up, her expression neutral but her mind rapidly calculating options. She could see they had been drinking heavily, could smell the alcohol on their breath, and recognized the dangerous combination of military training, inflated egos, and impaired judgment. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm actually about to leave," she replied calmly, her voice carrying no trace of fear or aggression. "Come on, don't be like that," Jake interjected, moving closer to her table. "We're Marines, ma'am. We serve our country. Least you could do is have a drink with us." The entitlement in his voice set off every alarm bell Sarah's training had installed in her psyche. She had encountered this attitude before, men who believed their service entitled them to whatever they wanted, particularly from women they perceived as civilians. "I understand you serve, and I respect that," Sarah said, standing slowly and shouldering her small purse. "But I really do need to go." Her movement to leave triggered something in the group dynamic. What had started as drunken flirtation began shifting toward something more sinister as they interpreted her polite refusal as rejection of not just their company, but their identity as Marines. "That's pretty rude," Marcus said, stepping closer and effectively blocking her path to the main exit. "Here we are, risking our lives for people like you, and you can't even spare 5 minutes for conversation?" Sarah felt the familiar calm that had descended on her in countless dangerous situations throughout her career. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled, as she assessed the tactical situation developing around her. 5 intoxicated men, each outweighing her by at least 50 pounds, were positioning themselves to prevent her escape while working themselves into an emotional state that could justify escalation. "I'm not trying to be rude," she said, her voice remaining level despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. "I simply have somewhere I need to be." "Bullshit," Tony said, his Brooklyn accent becoming more aggressive. "You've been sitting here alone for an hour. You got nowhere to be." The other patrons in the bar were beginning to notice the confrontation, but Sarah knew from experience that civilian intervention was unlikely until the situation became obviously violent. Most people preferred to avoid getting involved in conflicts between strangers, particularly when those strangers appeared to be military personnel. "Look, guys," Sarah tried once more, shifting her weight imperceptibly as she spoke. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm sure you're good Marines, but you've had a lot to drink, and this isn't going the way you probably intended when you walked over here." Her words, meant to de-escalate, had the opposite effect. The suggestion that they were too drunk to handle a simple conversation struck at their professional pride. "Too drunk?" Rodriguez repeated, his voice rising. "Lady, I've operated in combat zones while running on 2 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline. I think I can handle talking to one civilian." Sarah realized that further attempts at peaceful resolution were likely to fail. The group dynamic had taken over, turning what might have been manageable as individual conversations into a pack mentality that fed on itself. Each Marine was now performing not just for her, but for his peers, escalating the situation to avoid appearing weak in front of his brothers. "You know what I think?" Washington said, his voice taking on a darker tone. "I think you're one of those anti-military types. Probably think we're all just baby killers and war criminals." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the shift in their postures as they moved from attempted seduction to something approaching hostility. Their training was beginning to show through their intoxication, the way they unconsciously spread out to control space, the slight forward lean that preceded aggressive action, the hardening of their expressions as they shifted from seeing her as a potential conquest to viewing her as a potential enemy. Sarah's own training kicked in automatically. Years of combat experience had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to turn violent, and every indicator she had been taught to watch for was now present. Multiple aggressors, impaired judgment, wounded pride, and a group dynamic that was spiraling beyond any individual's control. She had two choices: submit to whatever they had planned and hope their basic humanity would prevent them from going too far, or defend herself using skills they had no idea she possessed. Neither option was appealing, but her training had taught her that hoping for mercy from aggressors was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Last chance," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that should have warned them they were making a serious mistake. "Walk away now, and we can all pretend this never happened." Instead of heeding the warning in her voice, the Marines interpreted her words as a challenge. The idea that a small civilian woman would threaten them struck them as so absurd that it actually increased their aggression. "Or what?" Jake laughed, stepping even closer. "You gonna call the police? File a complaint? We're United States Marines, sweetheart. We eat people like you for breakfast." Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, centering herself the way she had been taught during her most intensive training. When she opened them, something fundamental had changed in her demeanor. The civilian mask she had been wearing fell away, replaced by something much harder and infinitely more dangerous. "I gave you a chance," she said simply. What happened next would haunt the 5 Marines for the rest of their lives, not because of any physical pain they would endure, but because of how completely and thoroughly their understanding of themselves and their capabilities would be shattered in the space of 30 seconds. The transformation in Sarah was instantaneous and complete. The seemingly delicate woman who had been trying to avoid confrontation vanished, replaced by a weapon honed by years of the most intense military training available to American forces. Her posture shifted, her center of gravity lowered, and her hands moved to positions that would allow for maximum efficiency of movement. Rodriguez was the first to move, reaching out to grab her arm in what he probably intended as an intimidating but non-violent gesture. His hand never made contact. Sarah's response was a fluid combination of techniques drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. She deflected his reaching arm while simultaneously stepping into his personal space, her elbow driving into his solar plexus with precisely calculated force. The blow was designed not to cause permanent damage, but to disable his ability to breathe normally for several crucial seconds. Rodriguez doubled over, gasping, as Sarah used his momentary helplessness to position herself for the attacks she knew were coming from his companions. Jake was already moving, his larger size and reach giving him confidence that he could overwhelm her through brute force. His mistake was assuming that size and strength were the primary factors in combat effectiveness. Sarah ducked under his wild swing, her movement controlled and economical. As she came up, her palm struck upward into his nose, not hard enough to break it, but sufficient to cause his eyes to water and disorient him. Before he could recover, she had stepped behind him, using his own momentum to send him stumbling into Marcus, who was approaching from her left. The 2 Marines collided in a tangle of limbs, giving Sarah the precious seconds she needed to address the remaining threats. Tony was circling to her right, trying to get behind her, while David approached from the front. They were beginning to work together more tactically, their training overriding the alcohol-induced clumsiness that had characterized their initial approach. Sarah respected their improved coordination but remained confident in her superior preparation. While they had been trained for conventional combat, she had been prepared for situations where she would face multiple opponents with significant physical advantages. David lunged forward, attempting to tackle her around the waist. Sarah sidestepped at the last moment, using his momentum against him by placing her hands on his shoulders and guiding him face-first into the table she had been sitting at moments before. The impact was solid but controlled enough to stun him without causing serious injury. Tony had managed to get behind her during her engagement with David, and she felt his arms wrap around her in what he probably thought was an inescapable bear hug. His assumption proved incorrect as Sarah immediately dropped her weight, making herself heavier and harder to lift, while simultaneously driving her elbows backward into his ribs. The combination of pain and her shifted center of gravity broke his hold, allowing her to spin around and face him. A quick strike to a nerve cluster in his neck sent him to his knees, temporarily paralyzed but unharmed. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, and all 5 Marines were either on the ground or struggling to regain their composure. The speed and efficiency of Sarah's defensive actions had been so swift that most of the bar's other patrons had barely realized what was happening. It was only then, as the Marines lay groaning on the floor around her, that Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew her military identification. The silence that followed was deafening. The classic rock that had been playing seemed muted, and even the college students at the pool tables had stopped their games to stare at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. 5 Marines, each one a trained warrior, lay scattered around a small woman who stood calmly in the center of their unconscious forms, holding what appeared to be military identification. Sarah looked down at the men who had forced this confrontation, feeling a mixture of disappointment and professional frustration. She had genuinely hoped to avoid this outcome, knowing that what had just occurred would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Rodriguez was the first to recover, pushing himself up on his hands and knees while struggling to draw breath into his compressed diaphragm. The pain in his chest was intense, but it was nothing compared to the confusion flooding his mind as he tried to process what had just happened. "What the hell?" he gasped, looking up at Sarah with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. Sarah extended her military ID so he could see it clearly. The plastic card caught the dim bar lighting, revealing her photograph alongside text that made Rodriguez's blood run cold: Lieutenant Sarah Chan, United States Navy, Special Operations Command. "Navy SEAL," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the triumph or satisfaction that might have been expected. Instead, there was a profound sadness in her tone, as if she regretted not just the physical confrontation, but everything that had led to this moment. Jake had managed to sit up, his nose still streaming from her palm strike, and he could see the identification from where he sat. The implications of what he was reading began to penetrate through the alcohol and adrenaline clouding his thoughts. "You're He started, then stopped, unable to complete the sentence as the full magnitude of their mistake became apparent. "SEAL," Sarah confirmed, tucking the ID back into her purse. "Lieutenant, United States Navy Special Warfare Command. 8 years of service, 3 combat deployments, currently assigned to classified operations." The words hit the Marines like physical blows. Each man was intimately familiar with the reputation of Navy SEALs, the most elite special operations force in the American military. They had heard stories, watched documentaries, and harbored secret dreams of attempting the training themselves, though few Marines ever made the transition to naval special warfare. Marcus had recovered enough to stand, though he was still unsteady on his feet. The realization of who they had just attacked was beginning to sink in, and with it came a horror that went far beyond any physical pain he was experiencing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to come to attention despite his condition. We didn't know." "You didn't ask," Sarah replied, her tone neither accusatory nor forgiving. "You made assumptions based on how I looked, how I was dressed, where I was sitting. You decided I was someone you could intimidate or worse, without bothering to find out anything about who I actually am." Tony was still on his knees, the nerve strike having temporarily disrupted his motor control, but his mind was functioning clearly enough to understand the catastrophic nature of their error. As a lance corporal with aspirations of career advancement, he knew that assaulting a naval officer, particularly a SEAL, could end not just his military service, but potentially lead to criminal charges. "Lieutenant," he managed to say, struggling to his feet. "We were out of line. We had no right to approach you like that, and we sure as hell had no right to put our hands on you." David remained seated on the floor, a small cut on his forehead from his impact with the table. The physical injury was minor, but the emotional and professional damage was beginning to feel catastrophic. His father had been a Marine, his grandfather had been a Marine, and the thought of bringing shame to that legacy was almost unbearable. Sarah studied the 5 men, each now beginning to grasp the full scope of their mistake. She could see the progression of emotions playing across their faces, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding breeding horror, horror transforming into a shame so deep it threatened to crush their sense of self-worth. The question now, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her rank and training, is what we're going to do about this situation. The bar around them had not returned to normal. Other patrons continued to stare, many of them recording with their phones what they assumed was a woman defending herself against multiple attackers. The narrative they were constructing in their minds was probably closer to the truth than they realized, but the complexities of military culture and hierarchy made the situation far more nuanced than civilian observers could understand. Rodriguez had managed to stand, though he was still breathing carefully to avoid aggravating his injured ribs. As the senior enlisted man among the group, he felt the responsibility for their collective actions weighing heavily on his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said, attempting to maintain military bearing despite his condition. "Whatever consequences need to happen, they should fall on me. I was in charge of these men tonight, and I led them into this situation." Sarah appreciated his willingness to accept responsibility, but she also recognized the complicated dynamics at play. These men were Marines, proud warriors who had dedicated their lives to serving their country. What had happened tonight was a product of alcohol, poor judgment, and cultural assumptions that went far deeper than any individual failing. "Corporal Rodriguez," she said, having noted his rank insignia during the brief fight, "your willingness to accept responsibility for your men is admirable, but this situation involves more than just leadership decisions." She gestured toward the bar's other patrons, many of whom were still watching with obvious fascination. "We have witnesses, we have potential video evidence, and we have an incident that could easily become a public relations nightmare for both the Marine Corps and Naval Special Warfare Command." The implications of her words began to sink in. In an age of social media and instant communication, a video of Marines attacking a woman, even one who proved capable of defending herself, could go viral within hours. The damage to military recruiting, public perception, and inter-service relationships could be enormous. Jake wiped blood from his nose with his sleeve, the physical reminder of his poor judgment burning almost as much as the shame he felt. "What do you need us to do, ma'am?" Sarah considered her options carefully. She could report the incident through official channels, which would likely result in court-martial proceedings for all 5 Marines. Their careers would be over, their futures destroyed, and their families would bear the burden of their disgrace. Alternatively, she could handle this as a training opportunity, a harsh lesson that might actually make these men better Marines and better people. The choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate fate, but potentially the trajectory of their entire lives. "First," she said, "you're going to sit down, sober up, and listen to what I have to say. Then, you're going to decide if you want to be Marines who learn from their mistakes, or Marines who make excuses for inexcusable behavior." The 5 men moved to chairs around Sarah's table, their movements careful and respectful. The swagger and aggressive confidence they had displayed earlier had been completely replaced by the deference due to a superior officer, though the complexity of the situation made traditional military protocols somewhat awkward. Sarah remained standing, her presence somehow more commanding now that her true identity had been revealed. The woman who had seemed so delicate and vulnerable just minutes earlier now radiated the quiet authority that came from years of leading men in combat situations far more dangerous than a Jacksonville bar. "I need you to understand something," she began, her voice carrying across their small circle despite its quiet tone. "What happened here tonight didn't occur because you're bad Marines or because you're inherently bad people. It happened because you made assumptions about someone based on superficial characteristics, and those assumptions led you to believe you had the right to impose your will on another person." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but maintained eye contact as she spoke. The lesson she was delivering felt more intense than any reprimand he had received from superior officers, perhaps because it was earned through his own poor judgment rather than simple military infraction. "The woman you approached tonight wasn't just any civilian," Sarah continued. "She was a naval officer with a security clearance higher than any of yours, with combat experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, and with training and skills that most people can't even imagine exist." Marcus raised his hand slightly, a gesture that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of a classroom setting. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Granted. How were we supposed to know any of that?" The question came out more defensively than he had intended, and he immediately regretted the tone. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her response cut through his defensiveness with surgical precision. You weren't supposed to know, Lance Corporal. That's exactly the point. You approached me based on nothing more than the assumption that a woman sitting alone in a bar was automatically available for your entertainment. The truth of her words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Each man was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their actions had been based on entitlement rather than any legitimate social interaction. But it goes deeper than that, Sarah continued. The way you positioned yourselves around my table, the way you blocked my exit routes, the way you escalated when I declined your invitation, that wasn't flirtation or social interaction. That was tactical intimidation applied to a civilian setting. Tony felt sick to his stomach as he recognized the accuracy of her assessment. They had unconsciously used their military training to create a situation where a civilian woman would feel trapped and powerless. The realization that they had become the type of people they had joined the military to protect against was almost overwhelming. I've served with Marines, Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. I've fought alongside Marines, I've watched Marines die defending people they'd never met, and I've seen Marines display courage and honor that would humble anyone who witnessed it. She paused, letting the weight of their proud service record settle over them before delivering the crucial question. So I need you to tell me, are you Marines who had too much to drink and made a terrible mistake, or are you predators who happen to wear Marine uniforms? The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding not just an answer, but a fundamental examination of their character and identity. David was the first to respond, his voice barely above a whisper. We made a mistake, ma'am. A terrible, inexcusable mistake. I want to hear from each of you, Sarah said. And I want you to be honest, because your answer will determine how I handle this situation. One by one, they acknowledged their error. Rodriguez spoke of leadership failures and the responsibility he felt for allowing group dynamics to override good judgment. Jake talked about how alcohol had amplified his worst impulses and led him to behavior he would normally find reprehensible. Marcus admitted that he had been showing off for his friends rather than treating her with basic human respect. Tony's response was perhaps the most difficult to hear. Ma'am, I think I was angry at women in general. My girlfriend broke up with me while I was deployed, and I was taking that out on you. That's not an excuse, it's the truth. Washington's answer was the simplest and, perhaps most honest, there's no excuse for what we did. We acted like animals instead of Marines. Sarah listened to each confession, recognizing the genuine remorse in their voices. These were not hardened predators who felt entitled to victimize others. They were young men who had allowed alcohol, peer pressure, and poor judgment to lead them into behavior that contradicted their own values. Here's what's going to happen, she said finally. You're going to return to your base tonight and think very carefully about who you want to be as Marines and as men. Tomorrow, you're going to begin making amends for what happened here. She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, placing it on the table where they could all see it. That's the contact information for the Jacksonville Women's Crisis Center. They provide support for women who have experienced exactly the kind of intimidation and assault you attempted tonight. You're going to volunteer there, on your own time, until you understand the impact of what you almost did. The suggestion hit them like a physical blow. The idea of facing women who had been victimized by men like they had almost become was terrifying, but they also recognized the justice in her proposed consequence. How long? Rodriguez asked. Until you convince me that you've learned something meaningful about respect, consent, and the responsibility that comes with wearing that uniform, Sarah replied. Could be 6 months, could be 2 years. That's up to you. Jake raised his hand hesitantly. And if we do this, if we really commit to changing, what happens with the official report? Sarah had been considering this question throughout their conversation. Military justice demanded accountability, but she also believed in the possibility of redemption for those willing to do the work required. If you follow through on this commitment, if you genuinely change your behavior and make amends for what you did, then this stays between us, she said. But if I hear about any of you treating women, or anyone else, with anything less than complete respect, I'll make sure this incident becomes part of your permanent record. The relief on their faces was palpable, but Sarah wasn't finished. I also want you to understand something else, she said. What happened here tonight could have gone very differently. If I hadn't been trained to handle myself in combat situations, if I had been the civilian woman you assumed I was, you might have accomplished whatever you had planned. And that would have destroyed lives, hers and yours. The sobering reality of her words forced them to confront how close they had come to committing crimes that would have ended their careers and, potentially, sent them to prison. We understand, ma'am, Rodriguez said, speaking for the group. And, we're grateful for the chance to make this right. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained serious. Don't be grateful yet. Gratitude is something you earn through actions, not words. Show me that you're worthy of wearing those uniforms, and then we'll talk about gratitude. As the immediate crisis began to resolve, Sarah became aware that the bar around them was slowly returning to normal. The other patrons had gradually lost interest in their drama, though she noticed a few people still glancing in their direction occasionally. One more thing, she said, lowering her voice. Some of what happened here tonight was recorded. If any video surfaces that makes the military look bad, or if anyone tries to contact the media about this incident, I will not be as understanding as I've been tonight. The threat was delivered quietly, but its implications were clear. Sarah's position within naval special warfare gave her access to resources and connections that could make their lives very difficult if they chose to handle this situation inappropriately. Understood, ma'am, Tony said, and the others nodded their agreement. Sarah looked at each of them one final time, trying to assess whether they truly understood the magnitude of what had occurred and the opportunity they were being given. I'm going to leave now, she said. You're going to stay here for at least another hour, drink coffee, and make sure you're sober before you drive anywhere. Tomorrow, you contact that crisis center and begin your volunteer work. Questions? There were none. The 5 Marines sat in chastened silence as Sarah gathered her purse and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the exit, Rodriguez called after her quietly. Ma'am? She turned back. Thank you for not destroying our careers over our stupidity. Sarah paused for a moment, considering her response. Don't thank me, Corporal. Thank the Marines who came before you and set a standard high enough that I believe you can still live up to it. Don't prove me wrong. With that, she walked out of the bar, leaving 5 Marines to contemplate the hardest lesson of their military careers. The next morning arrived with the merciless clarity that only follows a night of terrible decisions. Corporal Mike Rodriguez woke in his barracks bunk with a pounding headache that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the crushing weight of shame that had settled over him during the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn. The previous evening played on an endless loop in his mind, each detail more humiliating than the last. He had led his men into a situation that could have destroyed their careers, their lives, and their families' respect for them. Worse still, they had done it to someone who had dedicated her life to the same service they claimed to honor. Rodriguez rolled out of his bunk and looked around the squad bay where his 4 companions were going through their own private reckonings with the previous night's events. Jake Thompson sat on the edge of his rack, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Marcus Washington was at his wall locker, methodically organizing gear that was already perfectly arranged, his mind clearly elsewhere. David Kim lay flat on his back, staring at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare that usually accompanied much more serious trauma. The small bandage on his forehead from his collision with the table served as a physical reminder of his poor judgment, but the real wounds were invisible and far deeper. Tony Castellano was the only one moving with purpose, though his actions seemed driven more by nervous energy than any clear plan. He was writing furiously in a notebook, occasionally crumpling pages and starting over, as if trying to find words adequate to express what he was feeling. The normal sounds of military life continued around them, other Marines preparing for the day's duties, the distant sound of reveille echoing across the base, the rhythmic cadence of morning physical training sessions beginning in the distance. The familiar routine that had once provided comfort and structure now felt hollow, as if they were imposters wearing the uniforms of better men. Rodriguez finally broke the silence that had settled over their group. We need to talk about last night. The simple statement drew the attention of his 4 companions, though none of them seemed eager to revisit the events that had brought them to this moment of reckoning. What's to talk about? Jake asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. We screwed up. We screwed up so bad we're lucky to still have careers. We're lucky to still have freedom, Marcus corrected. If she had pressed charges. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood how close they had come to facing court-martial proceedings for assault on a superior officer. The potential consequences ranged from dishonorable discharge to prison time, either of which would have followed them for the rest of their lives. David sat up slowly, wincing as the movement reminded him of his injuries. She gave us a chance we don't deserve, he said quietly. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Tony looked up from his notebook, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and unshed tears. I've been trying to write a letter, he said. Trying to explain to my family what happened. But, every time I start, I realize how pathetic it sounds. Rodriguez understood the impulse. The thought of facing his own family, particularly his younger sister, who had always looked up to him as her hero in uniform, was almost unbearable. How could he explain that he had become the type of person she had trusted him to protect her from? Maybe we don't explain it yet, Rodriguez suggested. Maybe we earn the right to tell that story by proving we learned something from it. The group fell silent again, each man wrestling with his own demons. The crisis center card that Lieutenant Chen had given them sat on Rodriguez's nightstand like an accusation, waiting for them to decide whether they had the courage to face the consequences of their actions. Jake was the first to voice what they were all thinking. I don't know if I can do it. Volunteering at a crisis center, facing women who've been through what we almost put her through. What if they can tell? What if they look at us and see what we are? What are we? Marcus asked, the question carrying genuine uncertainty rather than defensiveness. It was a crucial question that got